Good evening and welcome to Slippery Rock University's Power of Stories speaker series. My name is Keisha Booker and I serve as the interim chief diversity officer. Uh, the Office for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging welcome you to tonight's event. Storytelling is important to DEIB initiatives as stories have a transformative power that allows us to see the world in a different way than we do if we were to encounter it on our own. Stories are an entry point to understanding different experiences of the world. Stories reveal truths, encourage exploration, generate curiosity, and more. They become a connective tissue between time, people, and cultures. Before we begin, let's lay out the ground rules for tonight's experience. We ask that you all engage in active listening, remain muted unless our speaker or moderator are speaking with you. Turn on cameras when applicable, but we understand if you are unable to. When the time comes, we ask that you speak from your own experiences. Do not be afraid to disagree, but always do so respectfully. Tonight's presentation is participate by choice. We ask that you also do not invade the stories of others. The goal is not to agree, but to gain a deeper understanding. We ask that everyone, when speaking from their own experiences, that they speak up, but not over the experience of someone else. And that if your camera is on, that you are conscious of body language. For those who are interested, you can always turn on closed caption at the middle of your screen, which I have done so now, so everyone should have access to. And if you're interested, you can pin the speaker as he will be speaking for majority of the session. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Christopher, sorry, he just taught me how to say his name, Oliveira, a proud Slippery Rock University alumnus, class of 2015, psychology major. Dr. Oliveira directs the LGBTQ plus Equity Center at the University of Maryland, College Park. His journey in queer and trans advocacy began at SRU Pride Center, sparking a career dedicated to fostering inclusivity at colleges and universities. He's earned a PhD in sociology, and his research focuses on gender, sexuality, and race in the context of higher education. Prior to joining UMD, he led the LGBTQ plus centers at Princeton University, the University of Kansas, and St. Cloud State University. Dr. Alveida is an award-winning scholar and practitioner. He recently completed a national study of LGBTQ plus resource professionals and is currently co-editing Beyond the Center, a guide to queering every corner of campus. Christopher serves as the director of research for ACPA's Coalition of Sexuality and Gender Identity and is the former membership engagement director of the Consortium of Higher Education LGBT Resource Professionals. At Slippery Rock, he was president of Rockout from 2012 to 2015. Sorry. In his talk, Queer, Black, and Getting Away with It, The Power of Hope, Struggle, and Community, Kris unpacks his journey of joy, failure, success, grief, resilience, and resistance. To do this, he weaves together imagery, video, and storytelling to explore hope in the face of heartbreak and to emphasize the transformative power of persistence, struggle, and community. Without further ado, I present to you tonight's speaker, Christopher.
Yay, this is so fun. I absolutely love being back at Slippery Rock, virtually at least, and I do look forward to coming to campus once or twice a year when I can get there. But um, at any rate, let me get to it. So thank you all so much for having me today. I titled this talk Queer, Black, and Getting Away with It. And I'm not totally sure why. When the Office of Diversity and Inclusion reached out to me to do the virtual talk during LGBTQ plus History Month, it was honestly the first title that came to my mind. And when I reflect on my experiences, it feels just like that. Like I got away with something. Like I wasn't supposed to have the story that, or at least the stories that I'm going to unpack a little bit today. So I will share some images and pictures as we go throughout, just to share a little bit about who I am with you. So if you are a person with a historically and contemporarily oppressed identity, and if you've ever felt joy, you might know what the feeling of getting away with it feels like. You might have a little bit of an understanding of what I'm getting at. It's the idea that perhaps things are too good to be true, or that we weren't necessarily meant for success, or that some mistake has been made that gave us some good fortune. Sometimes we might think of that as something like imposter syndrome, but I think to call that feeling imposter syndrome is a little bit of a betrayal of the truth. We've heard of the term imposter syndrome before. It's that feeling like we aren't good enough, like we don't deserve to have the roles and experiences that we have, like we have managed to sneak in through the back door and found ourselves in fleeting positions of power. In essence, I think that imposter syndrome describes a really internalized feeling, one that is much more psychological. And I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from Slippery Rock, so I know a little bit about psychology. I first learned this term, imposter syndrome, in a psych class as a psych student at SRU. And I do think it still has merit. For example, I think that identifying the thoughts and feelings that seem to be imposter syndrome, that can be helpful. It helps us to curb that feeling when we recognize it. But still, I don't think it's adequate enough. I think a term like imposter syndrome puts a spotlight on each of us as individuals to process or cope with our feelings in our own way. And I think it leaves unfair or inequitable social structures in place. The bad things that happen around us, when we focus on imposter syndrome, it allows those things to remain in place. So when we say we are feeling imposter syndrome, what we're actually saying is this doesn't feel like this was made for me, or I'm not sure that I deserve to be here. So rather than address the part of the feeling that raises awareness about unequal structures, we instead focus on all of the ways that we don't fit the mold. So I think this is a type of deficit thinking, and I don't want us to do that anymore. And in other words, framing our communities at a disadvantage or at a risk simply by being members of the community isn't that great. We could rather use an asset-based approach, which would focus on the many contributions to the world, and a critical approach that will focus on balancing the imbalance of power. So that's how I think about it. All of that is to say, I've got a lot of imposter syndrome here chatting with y'all. So I want to say also though that that type of deficit thinking, this like imposter syndrome, it really relates to me for concepts like burnout. If you are someone who has done DEI work, or if you're someone who does a lot of work to help organize things, or you're really focused or involved in your community, you know that feeling of like I've poured too much of myself out and I can't quite pull it back together. So my friends and I, some of my colleagues, we published some research about burnout, and we engaged in an autoethnographic study to make sense of what was happening to diversity work all across the United States. And I think you've probably heard about it, right? You've heard about places like Texas, where my good friend Mel, who is also a former Rockout president, thanks for being here, Mel. Places like Texas, where Mel is from, and Florida, where I lived and studied, and Tennessee and Oklahoma and Kansas. We know that that work is under attack, and the folks that are in those places have felt that burnout. So you've heard about it. And what we learned through our study is that many diversity workers in higher education have this feeling of burnout in their work. However, in explaining their feelings, they often describe the ways that institutions systematically burn through the employees. So rather than feeling that feeling as an individual, I'm burned out, I poured myself completely out, a new framework is thinking about what social structures are in place that allow an individual to have that experience in the first place. So when we point to organizations or institutions and policies and practices, we get a little bit closer to addressing our problems, and the things that maybe make us feel like we have imposter syndrome or burnout. And what I would say is, in sciencey words, we should maybe consider addressing the cause and not the effect. We should maybe consider addressing the virus and not the symptoms. So there's a lot also going on in our world. I'm setting the stage for the stories I'm going to tell you. There are mass casualties happening around the world, and humanitarian relief has become a campaign talking point, right? I know that we all come to this talk today with some awareness of heartbreak that's happening around the world. We're growing through what could be the most politically contentious election cycle of our generation. The planet is getting warmer. I'm not sure what is happening on the East Coast, y'all, but this has been goofy, the weather this last couple. I think we've done winter and summer, right? The world's getting warmer. Higher education has once again come under fire politically and socially. The cost of living is rising. It is hard out here, y'all, or yins, excuse me. And somehow, even though it's hard out here, I find myself getting away with it. I'm not sure what it is that I'm getting away with, but somehow I manage to be getting up every day and getting away with being Black and queer and talking to folks about it. So rather than feel like I shouldn't be here, wherever here is, or continue to feel blistering burnout, I've decided that even if our social world isn't always ready for queer and Black and brown lives, I can move forward and be a part of the movement that fully embraces us. All right, so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got away with it. Again, maybe we'll figure out what it is. I think it has something to do with community. I'm going to share evidence with you in the form of pictures and some videos and a few quotes. I will share a bit about my time before, during, and after Slippery Rock. I'll share about my family and coming out, my professional journey, and my thinking about this current moment. So, what can you expect from this conversation? Well, I won't spend too much time on the specifics of my experience working with Rockout, though you are free to ask me anything about that or my professional work within LGBTQ plus centers. And you can feel free also to engage throughout using the Zoom feature, using the Zoom chat feature. I often struggle to tell meaningful stories about myself because they don't feel typical or necessarily narrative. My life is in a series of like neat chapters that I could put together. It's really messy, it's not linear, and it often defies a really easy explanation. I think we can all relate to that if we had to try to tell a story about ourselves. But in this talk, I'm going to work to weave together bits of my journey, and I'm going to try to touch on the themes of joy and failure. I think failure is one of the queerest things that we can do. Success, grief, resilience, and resistance. So who am I? I've done all that talking. Who am I? My name's Kris Veda. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm currently working as the director of the LGBTQ plus Equity Center at the University of Maryland. My administrator caveat is that all of the things that I say do not represent my institution or the center that I work in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As some of you may know, I'm a proud Slippery Rock alum from the class of 2015 alongside Mel, again, who's on this call. I served as the Rockout president from 2012 to 2015. And I think during that time, I always had a co-president, some really fantastic people that I love and hold near and dear to my heart. And I was a student representative for GISO, right? GISO. I want to call it something else. GISO, the President's Commission for Gender Identity, Expression, and Sexual Orientation. It is so funny how much has changed since I was at Slippery Rock. It's been almost 10 years since I graduated, which is wild. But some things, like that feeling of home, like that feeling of finding myself, feel the same at Slippery Rock when I'm there. So I'm excited to be back, and I want to say thank you for having me. So we're going to go back in time a little bit, and I want to share with you about where I come from outside of Pittsburgh. I was, I would frame myself as a resourceful, lucky, and very poor mixed gay kid from McKeesport, Pennsylvania, who knew that college opened doors, but I didn't know who would open the doors to college for me. And I was raised by an extended family and a truly divine community of women, including my mother, Carrie, my grandmothers, my aunties, my aunts, Carrie and Sharon and Petey and Jessica and Hattie and Tori and Terry and Sue and Tony and Lossie and Nyoka and Jean and Kim and Amy are just some of the women who raised me before I got to Slippery Rock. I grew up with food stamps and income assistance. But I always say that when I was growing up, we were the fun kind of poor. That's how I used to say it. We were the fun kind of poor. And I know that's absurd, but what it really meant was that my childhood was stacked with traumas and uninhibited joy, and that my parents shielded us from a lot of the harsh realities of our circumstances. I believed that everyone shared the same general experiences as me. And what it means to me is that even though we had very little, my parents worked very hard to make sure that my siblings and I had enough food to eat and had a structurally stable home to live in. And there often wasn't much left over for luxury goods like toys or games and media, but we did have those things too. And I share this with you to give you a small semblance of what my life was like. There's a lot more story in there, a lot to unpack, but we'll leave it at that for now. I would like to, though, talk to you about that time and introduce you to who I am through food. So this chapter, as I call it, is called "Stuffed Cabbage and Greens." So the second thought that I had when I was preparing for this talk was a shameless thought. It was, how am I going to work in Wicked the musical into this conversation? And I want you to know there was no segue. This is that moment, but I am a shameless person and I'm obsessed with that show. And I have a very queer connection to the 1939 version of The Wizard of Oz. And so you'll see on this slide a very young, a very queer 4-year-old me, so excited to get his first Wicked Witch Barbie doll on Christmas in 1996. That's it. That's the connection to Wicked. Now we're going to talk about food. So now that we've got that out of the way, one of the best ways to understand who I am and to know me is to know that I'm a foodie. My first awareness of community and family and connection was through food. I assumed that everyone ate collard greens with ham hock like my father's family and stuffed cabbage like my mother's maternal grandmother, my Bubba. If your family makes collard greens for the holidays, you know the way that the aroma of the steaming leaves and pork melds together and it fills the entire house with this humid and warm and savory scent. And if you've ever had stuffed cabbage, you know that it takes forever to make and that the reward is like a tangy and filling and piping hot bowl of history. And if you haven't had that before, or at least prior to this presentation, your stomach is probably grumbling because it's almost 5 o'clock or it is 5 o'clock. But that for me was my history. For as long as I can remember, my plate of food was piled to the edges with stuffed cabbage and greens and turkey and mac and cheese made the right way. And for those of you in the room who know what I'm talking about, the right way. I always skipped the chitlins because it wasn't for me and added every sweet I could get my fingers on. And this was the primary way I described what it was like to grow up in what I called a black and white house. It was the only real world illustration I could give folks to describe what it felt like to be me. Being biracial for me was the feeling of fullness that I felt when eating these eclectic meals. It was that feeling of experiencing it all at once on the holidays. That fullness is what being a mixed race queer boy felt like. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a lot of joy in that. Everything about who I was from those formative years was seen and experienced through a racialized lens. I understood my race, as I called it at 3-year-old, as a beautiful caramel color, and thought that mixed race traditions were best exemplified in what I called black and white holidays. This metaphor helped me affirm my experience in the world and communicate it to others. As a very young person, I saw the absolute beauty in rich cross-cultural experiences in people. In my framing of this food, there was hope and community, and just beneath the surface, I was missing the history of struggle and grief and survival and resilience that persisted through that food across decades and centuries. Yet I think back about that plate and I think about the ways that the foods were always distinct. They kind of touched each other on the plate if you were the person who allowed your food to touch. Um, but they were also distinguishable and culturally specific. Others, including me, could look at that plate and name the items. And I found that others were able to identify my ingredients too. The way that I spoke and walked and ate and studied and dressed and crossed my legs and waved hello and listened to music and dance were often the subject of critique and comparison in racialized and gendered ways. And as a child, adults and children alike frame me and my actions in monolithic ways. I was either being Black or being white, being gay or being straight, being masculine or being feminine. And as a child, my lived and embodied experience was the fullness that I felt after Thanksgiving dinner. And when other people tried to understand my experience, it was like they tasted and enjoyed only the flavors that were palatable to them, those that they could understand, and the others were ignored or disparaged, especially along racialized lines. Some of my earliest formative memories center quirky stories about race, like the time that my grandmother thought that the tan on my feet was soot from the playground and spent 15 minutes trying to scrub it off in the bathtub. My formative memories also include learning what it means to be called the N-word and being told I wasn't like other Black people or other white people. So as quickly as this richness that I learned as a child through this food metaphor, as quickly as I learned that, almost immediately this otherworldly joy that I experience as a mixed race queer person, being this bridge between, being this embodied blend of spices, almost immediately I learned that I would need to develop survival strategies in order to risk being typecast or dismissed. I don't know truly what those survival strategies were, but I know that being queer and being gay saved my life. And by age 7, I was aware that I was gay and that I would also need to learn to protect myself. And so what I've showed you here is one of my favorite memories. The last time I was at Slippery Rock, or the last time I presented at Slippery Rock was actually the night before my mom passed away. So I'm being very vulnerable in sharing all this with you. And my time at Slippery Rock was actually a time that I shared a lot in the car with my mom on the way back. And those memories are really special to me. And this one is uh, one of the most important memories I have of her, as she taught me how to make the stuffed cabbage recipe, and we never wrote it down. So in fact, this video is the only artifact that I have in its full length that shows me how to make it when I'm ready to make it. So this was me growing up. And at the same time, I was experiencing the education system. So growing up, my siblings and I were raised variably between the ornate pageantry of a Polish Catholic church and the thundering zeal of a Black Southern Baptist church, where we went to services in Braddock, Pennsylvania. And the wildest thing about religious rearing was that our parents didn't actually participate. So we would get in the car on Sunday morning, and as folks did who went to services, except our parents didn't get out of the car. They would drop us off and we would go to church and and then they would pick us up when it was over. They would drop us off at CCD or Sunday school, and then they would pick us up later. And I never really got to the bottom of this, but I suspect that there was probably some pressure from our grandparents to ensure that we received some type of spiritual guidance. I don't remember much of my time in either of those traditions beyond serving as an altar boy for many years and also starring as the lead in the Passions of the Christ, as Jesus Christ on the Easter production of the Passions. Can you picture it, folks? Golden browned wig. I mean, nodded to the gods. It hadn't been brushed probably in 20 years. 8 years old, cute, snatched. That was me. My other favorite story, which I'm telling you, this is going to connect to nothing except for grace and involvement in community, is the time that I learned this forgiveness and what it means to have good intentions. And so I think my mom also learned a lesson along the way about what it means to drop your kids off at church and leave. One morning, my mom said to me, she was taking a shower and she called from the shower. She said, "Christopher, can you come here for a second?" And I made my way to the door and I said, "Yeah, mom." And she said, "I want you to grab the $20 off the kitchen counter and give it to your grandma. She's going to take you to church. And I want you to use that to grab for the donations." And I thought, wow, that's really, we're poor, but I guess if we got $20 to give for donations, we've got $20 to give for donations. So I return that day after services are over, and my mom looks at me and she says, "Well, Christopher, where's the dozen donuts I asked you to pick up?" She said donuts, not donations. And I learned a lot about grace and forgiveness and good intentions in that moment because she couldn't punish me for making a contribution to the church. Although I can't account for my parents' involvement, the only thing that they taught us to consistently embrace more than religion and family was the idea that education was the key to everything. And as an educational sociologist, I couldn't agree more, but perhaps not for the same reasons. My parents, my siblings, and I, and our entire extended family were largely born into a generational cycle of poverty. And education and hard work were the only ways to get ahead, they taught us. Today, I understand education, that term, education, to be about the credential that we get, the degrees, the accomplishment, the saying I did school, the resume lines, the things that that give one access to other institutions of power, right? So we get that degree and we can get a good paying job, hopefully, or low interest loans to purchase a house or whatever it is that our dreams are. But back then, doing well in school in the education system was a militant philosophy that when violated in my house, always resulted in a punishment, a whooping, what we actually called punishment, which was being grounded, or copying lines from a textbook. And I'll tell you a true story. If you could see my handwriting today, it's cute, y'all. But when I was in third grade, my cursive was terrible. And my teacher reached out to my parents and notified them that I wasn't doing well and that if not corrected, I'd be failing the handwriting section of our class. And so I spent the entire month of February and March copying where the red fern grows into a lined notebook. And I'm pretty sure that I still have that Type 2 Ticonderoga pencil embedded into my right middle finger. I was taught to do well at school in order to get ahead, otherwise, you'd be punished, either at home or by the social world. So it's no surprise then that I enrolled in school from August 1996 and didn't finally graduate until August 6th of 2022. Nearly 26 straight years of school before finally being traumatized enough to complete the PhD just a few short years ago. School is where I was taught that education happens. It was my escape, and learning became a survival skill. School was the place where I learned that other students who shared some of my experiences were learning different things at home. And I wanted to learn that too. I learned that challenges are best addressed with others who can lift you up when you cannot lift yourself up. I went to a predominantly white high school, and there were a lot of LGBTQ plus students in my class. In fact, we used to joke that there was something really good or glittery in the water. We didn't all run in the same circles per se, but there was a sort of solidarity that happened between us as we lived out our truth in the late 2000s. We were the first to bring our dates to the prom, some were among the first to transition in our suburban Pittsburgh community, and we all knew and cared for each other in distant and also familiar ways. And I've given you some of my horror story photos. I haven't kept some of the more incriminating ones, including the time that big chunky glasses were cute, and I used to wear them to all the cheerleading competitions. What I've learned in my brief 32 years is that you need community to struggle alongside you. And I learned that through school. And you also need community to find hope. And the two are symbiotic because there's no struggle without hope, and there's no hope without struggle. And I'm going to come back to this, but I want you to know for now that I found hope in community by sharing space with other queer people and people of color whose openness became a safe haven in a changing and evolving world. They made our white, cis heteronormative community in southwestern Pennsylvania feel like a more welcome place for a Black and queer youth like me. So I really learned to tell my coming out story when I was at Slippery Rock. We used to do this program called Straight Talks, which was a quippy, fun name, right? Because it's like queer folks talking about being queer, but we called it a straight talk. Like it doesn't get any quippier than that. But part of that was learning to share our stories in ways and in means that were in service of our community, helping to promote inclusion and acceptance across campus. So for years, people have asked me to tell my coming out story. But the truth is, I don't really see it as coming out. And as others have framed it, I really understand it as inviting the people in my life in. This is already who I am, and I invite you all into that story. I invite others into that story. I came out for the first time on December 6th, 2006, to Gina D, who was a member of the cheerleading squad that I was on in high school and senior or in my first year. And I had a huge crush on a boy in our class, and we'll call him Nathan. And she asked me if I was taking anybody to the dance, and I told her, yes, but I'm not comfortable. I don't want to tell you who because you'll make fun of me. And a long story short, it was really hard to come out as the only boy on the cheerleading squad. Everybody else was already making the assumptions, and so it was more like living out my truth in a way that felt most authentic to me. And what I discovered in coming out and in letting folks in was is that I was able to build a community of solidarity. We've all seen the I can't believe I'm about to say it the way that I'm about to. We've all seen the old movies, which were not they're not old, they're only like 15 years ago, where someone comes out and it's it's horrible and their experience in high school was not all that great. But what I found was when all of your friends are the cool popular cheerleaders, you built this insulation around you where people were much more willing to hear your side of the story when they knew that the people that they also aspired to be like were in your close corner or in some of your closest corners. Coming out to my friends was not hard. Coming out to my family was much harder. But I was foolish, y'all. I was so, so foolish. Do we remember MySpace as a concept? I was the most clever 15-year-old boy in Western Pennsylvania. I had decided that I would lead a double life on MySpace. I had my straight MySpace, which was all my cheerleading and band things, and Wicked, that's the second mention. And I had my alter ego. Right, so that was the straight one, just to be certain. That was the straight identity, and the queer identity was the one that made connections with other queer youth in the region. And one day I found myself, it was since right before I think my junior year, and I was in the car with my mom, and she said to me, "Christopher, are you gay?" And I said, "No, what? I couldn't imagine. What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, I found a MySpace and it says that you were gay." And I was like, "Oh, that Mel, she's always playing jokes on me and hacked my account." The long story short is I didn't learn from that experience and I left that account open and my mom followed up on her questions about 6 months later. And I told her, please don't tell my dad. I don't know how he'd react. I don't know. I don't know what will happen to me. So the rest of high school was pretty good. I made it all the way through. I got to take the boy to the dance. I had queer friends. Things seemed to be going well. I was starting to get nervous about college. I didn't know how folks paid for that. But finally, I was moving into Slippery Rock and we were driving up 79, right highway. Did I get it? We're driving up 79, and I'm in my mom's car, and my dad's in his truck, wheeling my things from McKeesport to Slippery Rock. And we get to the McDonald's, right? One of the like five restaurants in town. My mom wants a sweet tea, and I wait for my dad. I'm waiting outside with my dad in the car. And he says, arguably, what will probably be one of the more inappropriate things he has ever said to me. He says, "Christopher, I was going to tell you to check out the hot girls that were just going into the restaurant, but that would be counterproductive, wouldn't it?" And that was the moment that I realized that my dad was inviting me into his form of acceptance. And so I had these quirky moments and these quirky fears across time about how my family would respond, but ultimately it was a really beautiful story. And what I found at Slippery Rock were that there were people who didn't share the same story as me. I had the close friend whose father was a minister and who physically assaulted her with religious text. I had friends who had experienced suicide ideation and crisis because their communities hadn't accepted them for what they were. So even though I came from this background that wasn't always affirming, I had the support of a community at home to sustain me through a really hard and difficult and changing time. So for me, coming out was what hope felt like embodied. It was the hope that when allowing others to know more fully who I am, I'm opening the door for possibly others to do the same. It was the hope that others would see me and that I could find community and strength and sustenance through others like me. It was that hope, I think, at Slippery Rock that became a reality. So Slippery Rock. Um, oh my gosh, so much to say. I don't often tell this story, but I was really eager to make LGBTQ plus community when I was younger. And in January 2010, as I was finishing high school and had been accepted to a few different colleges, I didn't know how to get into college. I just filled out the applications that the guidance counselor gave me, and I did one visit to Slippery Rock, and I said that felt like home. That's where I'm going. So I already had a queer community in high school, but I was really, really curious about what that would look like in college, and particularly finding queer communities of color. And so one of my favorite memories of my entire life is the time that I cold messaged a Pittsburgh drag queen named Georgia B. Cummings on MySpace. And I asked her very astutely, how can I get involved with LGBTQ plus life in the city of Pittsburgh? And she looked at me and she said, "Honey, have you been watching Queer as Folk?" To which I shamelessly replied, "Yes, I had." And so if you've seen the show, you know that it's a lusty series from the early 2000s that centers the lives of gay men and lesbians in the city of Pittsburgh, with lots of flashy club scenes and sexy stints all over town. And she told me that the real world was nothing like that. I mean, it wasn't even filmed in Pittsburgh, y'all. So she told me that she'd be happy to recommend some places, but that finding community would was about being able to be, as she put it, out and proud with friends and a family that loves you. Although I did not know it at the time and very likely took it for granted, I'd had a LGBTQ plus affirming community around me for some time, but I needed that search, and I really valued that search as I went into college. And what I found was is that it actually became the catalyst for the career that I took on. So when I arrived at Slippery Rock University in the fall of 2010 as a music major and band geek, all I knew was that I wanted to be a band teacher and find the gays and help the movement. That's all. So after 2 weeks on campus, I discovered that there was a small LGBTQ plus student organization with about a dozen members that met in the Women's Center. And it used to be housed in the basement of BSB. Does that building still exist? BSB? Strain Behavioral? It was called Rockout, and I could not wait to be a member. I can remember asking my very cool and very popular roommate to take me to the meeting, which inevitably felt like a secret support group where we could just show up and be ourselves. And I knew that the group in this form had been around for many, many years, and that they did programs and civic engagement work, and they helped LGBTQ plus students find community and help us to connect to faculty and staff. I think I'd maybe attended 3 meetings before the executive board, which included Atticus and Tim and Stephen and Josh, mentioned that there was a Pride Center in the basement of the old student union and that it was managed by the Women's Center. I said, "There's a what?" That moment may not seem as significant to you, but this was the exact moment that I discovered the existence of LGBTQ plus resource centers. And in that moment, a very small seed was planted that has shaped the rest of my formal education, my professional experience, and my entire life. And so, in many ways, many of the people who work on your campus are the very people who ultimately, through their advocacy across time, shaped my whole life. I'm not sure if any of you know the story of the original Pride Center and how it came to be, but it's an important story to me as somebody who studies the work of LGBTQ plus resource centers and works within them. And I also think that knowing these histories also helps us to advocate for other needed improvements on our campuses. There's probably many students who are on this call who are thinking about ways to improve the experience of LGBTQ plus students. And that's the first step. It's figuring out what you're going to do with that curiosity and turn that into organizing or a movement or advocacy. Unlike the presidential debate proceedings, I do like to be fact checked. So please feel free to chime in the chat for my folks who've been around for a minute and who know this story. But the President's Commission on Gender Identity, Expression, and Sexual Orientation was formed in the spring of 2006. And the LGBTQ plus Pride Center was established in the basement of the old Union in October of 2007. And you can find a really great write-up from just 5 years ago through the Rocket. It's archived on the website. There's a really great graphic that shows a timeline. I actually remember when that was created. It was very exciting, even as an alumni. What you won't find in that write-up is the knowledge that several founding members of the President's Commission were central to writing a grant that helped to establish those resources on campus, the very grant that ended up becoming the legacy of the Pride Center today at Slippery Rock. And that includes the first iteration of the center's library, as well as funds to pay one student worker to work in the formal Pride Center space. My history tells me that those early advocates included Dr. Catherine Massey, who also happened to be my academic advisor in psychology, and Dr. Colleen Cook, who recently retired. This history is important because centers are often founded and established on grant dollars or other shifting financial structures. For many years, that center did not have reliable funding and instead relied on students and faculty and staff to pour their time and energy and resources and even their own money into the center to ensure that LGBTQ plus students, as well as faculty and staff, could have a safe haven on campus to find and sustain community. What you'll also struggle to find is a really good picture of what the center looked like, that early, busted, dusty closet. The best one I can give you is the rainbow image on this page. I remember when I first walked into that room as a second semester first year student, I was enthralled. First, you could not find this room unless you were told explicitly how to get to it. And the end of the directions almost always ended with a phrase that was something like, if you feel like you're going to the wrong place, you're probably in the right place. It was in the back of an outdated and seedy looking arcade and billiards tables around. I was quickly made privy to the fact that only 4 years earlier, the room had been the primary meeting space for the hunting and fishing group on campus. And I cannot say enough how badly it looked, but it was our space on campus. There was this exposed wood paneling on many of the walls, and the room was shaped like a long rectangle. There was mixed-matched furniture and a small desk at a computer where the student workers sat for 10 to 20 hours per week. And we begged Jody Solito, the former Women's Center and Pride Center director, and the first LGBTQ plus resource professional that I'd ever met, to hire me to help in the center. We had really limited funds, but she brought me on board on the Women's Center's dollar, and I've been doing this type of work ever since. And although Slippery Rock was a predominantly white institution, Rock Out in the Pride Center was the one place on campus where I felt at home, and I worked hard with my friends to make those spaces feel like a home for others. We grew our group from about 12 people to 100 in 3 years. And I understand that that work continues today. And I found community and an interest that pulled me away from music and towards the social sciences. And I was getting away with making a career out of supporting marginalized people. All right, so I've talked a lot about the good and fluffy of Slippery Rock, but I don't mean to romanticize that picture of LGBTQ plus inclusion, because my time at Slippery Rock was among the best and worst of my entire life. And it's weird to say this, but I hope that it's also true for, it's weird to say that, and I hope it's true for you too. including our faculty and staff. I hope that your experiences give you the most remarkable memories that shape a life well lived, and that you're challenged and discouraged and disappointed, and that you experience heartbreak in ways that highlight your values, commitments, and opportunities to build something more meaningful. We had our share of the latter during my time on campus, including addressing anti-LGBTQ plus attitudes on campus, confronting and de-escalating hostile street preachers. I think there's a photo of there, and almost losing our Pride Center when the Smith Student Center began construction and we were displaced from our quirky center at the bottom of the hill. There was a moment where we thought we would lose that space. During each of these moments, there were many tears and arguments and meetings in Old Main and strategy sessions with our advisors, because our goal was simply to make sure that LGBTQ plus people had a place on campus and to maintain the limited resources that had taken so long to get in the first place. And we won that space time and again, and I understand that you're still winning that space today. So I'm happy to share more about those stories at the end. But what I want to highlight is this: that struggle helped us to articulate hope in community with one another. Struggle helped us to articulate hope, what we wanted to do. It helped us to articulate hope in community with one another. There was no playbook, only an ethic and culture of care that was about making sure that each of us belongs and has the support structures in place to thrive. We grew a diverse group of LGBTQ plus and allied students into a space that held intergroup conversations about race and religion and politics. We created space for each other in ways that aren't always possible. And what I'm most proud of about my time at Slippery Rock was seeing the development of a thriving LGBTQ plus student population that went from a dozen people in the basement of an old classroom building to a cute, albeit small, office on the second floor of the new Smith Student Center. So as I'm moving towards wrapping up, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot is about the sheer volume of symbolism that exists at Slippery Rock. And at SRU, I believe it's a we, because I still feel myself very a part of that community. We have these rocks that are on campus. And maybe you've seen them on the campus tour. They're right below the Smith Center, and you'll pass them on the way to Old Main. When you're doing your campus tour, inevitably the tour guide's going to say, these rocks symbolize your time at the sorry, not University of Maryland. These rocks symbolize your time at Slippery Rock University. And we're told that students come in rough and they leave polished. But if I'm being honest, that framework always felt a little backward to me. The shiny sphere implies that students leave feeling like they've mastered their content and are now prepared to tackle the tough issues that plague the 21st century. Each rock is placed alone by itself along the path, and with no other inputs, we abstractly see how each undergraduate student passes from first year to the last. But you hear it, right? It's a little misleading. Maybe it's the sarcastic tone in my voice. But comparatively, I arrived at SRU feeling very confident and very sure about who I was and what I wanted to be. And by the time I left, I felt rough around the edges, but more stable, more grounded, and more like that first rock you passed than the last one. Like I could lift something else up. So as I've sat with this metaphor in preparation for this talk, it occurred to me that maybe we aren't like any of the rocks that are on that trail, that maybe we are more like the rocks that sit in the center of the quad. You know the ones that I'm talking about, the ones that are on this image. We see one that is lifting up another. And beyond that symbolism, we rely on the boulders for strength to get through the hard times. We go to the rock to rub it for good luck, right? And we all know the rumors and the stories. Sometimes people pee on us. And still, the boulders hold each other up and they weather the test of time, right? They've been there. We all know the stories, but that rock, I think, better symbolizes the time. It's right in the center of the campus fold. It's where everything's happening. And those 2 or 3 rocks are not alone. These boulders stood in the backdrops as we hosted vigils and celebrations and exchanged dialogue. They symbolized endurance and community, and they offer a response to struggle and a vision for hope. They symbolize the ever-changing role of the lifter and the lifted, and sometimes we're everything and all of those things at once. And they reminded me of the ways that I was lifted up by faculty and staff and other students at Slippery Rock, like Dr. Massey and Jody Salido and Dr. Solano and Dr. Otakowski and Cindy Lacombe and Sue Hadley and Laura Chang and Robert Lagnice and Dr. Dykstra and Miss Kaiser and Mel Seymour and Matt Rapp and Brock Dennis and Ashley Moeller and Mark Byers and Aaron Carr and so many others. These are the boulders that helped me to get away with being Black and queer at SRU. So there's a lot happening in the world, and I don't want to downplay that. And I think it's important to name that as a part of our LGBT History Month talk. So as I shared earlier, during my time at SRU, I realized my career in LGBTQ plus advocacy existed. It was like discovering something hidden in plain sight. And towards the end of my time at SRU, I was fortunate to be offered a summer internship with the Human Rights Campaign with the help of my advisors and mentors. And I moved to Washington, D.C. for the summer, where I ultimately met my now husband, Alfredo. And by the time I returned for my final year at Slippery Rock, I had decided that I wanted to be an LGBT resource director and I wanted to get a PhD in sociology. And after a year of graduate school, a bit of luck, some odd timing, a pinch of experience, and a little dose of advocacy, I landed my first role as the director of the LGBT Resource Center at St. Cloud State University. And since that time, I've had the pleasure of leading the centers at the University of Kansas, Princeton University, and currently at the University of Maryland, College Park. And while each of these campuses has offered me a really varied perspective on the lives and experiences of LGBTQ plus people in higher education, what remains constant in the work are the values and principles that I learned at Slippery Rock, in the Pride Center, and through Rock Out. And those were the coalescing of hope and struggle and community. And today, DEI work is under attack. Here's some headlines that you'll find on the Chronicles webpage. And it's weird to see your job and your community in the news and having life-saving resources stripped from them. And I'm fortunate that I have not worked on a campus where the center has been dismantled, although the KU Center did recently shutter its doors for their Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity. And I led that space during the pandemic, and it's heartbreaking to see what's happening there. Sometimes it can feel distant, right? You're not on a campus. We can have these talks where about inclusion, but it's important to consider how we can work across ideological lines to ensure that we're building the campuses and the communities that we want to see. And if it feels distant to you, let us be reminded that GISO and the Pride Center have existed for less than 20 years. The Pride Center has only been open for about 10 years, or the Pride Center has only been open in its current location for about 10 years. And I previously shared that there was a brief moment where students had to raise their voices to make sure that we secured a home in the new student union. So what I ask you is, what can you or will you raise your voices about? In these questions, I'm asking you to name your struggle individually and collectively, locate what hope looks like on the other end of that struggle, and then lean into the community where you can contribute to those goals meaningfully. And so I want to leave you with hope. My dissertation research was about LGBTQ plus resource professionals, and it was a national study of folks doing this work. And in the midst of my dissertation, I completely lost hope in this work. And as a very young person who has another 30 years, at least in this field, that's heartbreaking to deal with. I was hearing the heartbreaking stories from colleagues in the field that felt all too familiar. And I thought, what is the point of all of this? This is going nowhere. Yet I was so close to finishing that, we'll say, effing paper in that degree that I'd spent so much time on. And I stopped writing and I started reading. And in that process, I found hope again. And it allowed me to once again struggle in community for a better future. And with that, I found Jose Esteban Munoz's quotes. Jose Esteban Munoz, who passed in 2015, was a cultural scholar, and he theorized about hope in the face of heartbreak. He said that hope's biggest obstacle is failure. Hope falters when we lose hope. but we need hope to think otherwise in the face of odds that are stacked against us. In part, we must take on a kind of abstract hope that is not much more than merely wishing. No, instead, we need to participate in a more concrete hope, a hope that is grounded and consequential, a mode of hoping that is cognizant of exactly what obstacles present themselves in front of us at the same time that we have to face those obstacles. So, hope to me looks like understanding the here and now, but seeing a queer and inclusive future where social power dynamics don't define real world problems. I also reflect on the ongoing impact on trans and non binary people, especially TNB people of color. And I think we've got to do better serving trans and non binary folks, including implementing binding and tucking programs and partnerships with our university health center and establishing pools of funds that can be accessed by LGBTQ plus student organizations to host meaningful programs and events and resources. And in both cases, student organizations and faculty and staff groups can build coalitions to articulate and amplify their needs for our campus community. And so, my hope for SRU students is that you continue to work toward a community that doesn't just tolerate differences, but celebrates them. If you'll indulge me for one last moment, I'd like to tell you about the time that I almost gave everyone on campus food poisoning at Slippery Rock. Let's see how calm I said that. One of my favorite traditions that Rock Out established during our time was what we called the holiday dinner and the end of the year Rock Out cookout. Holiday dinner was a big family style meal where the student organizations paid for all of their main courses, and anyone who attended brought a side of their choosing. And it's no surprise that this tradition was so special to me. As a young, mixed race Black boy, food was the only way I could really illustrate the ways that culture and identity and experience is nourishing and fulfilling. So each year, the dinner would get bigger and bigger, and the Rockout Executive Board would purchase the biggest turkey we could find, determined to prepare it from scratch. The trouble with purchasing the biggest turkey you can find the night before the holiday dinner is that you don't have enough time for it to thaw. Google was even more unreliable, if you can imagine. But I learned that if we prepared an ice bath in our double wide sink, we could potentially thaw the turkey in about 16 hours under running cold water. And we did, and everyone ate it. Well, almost everyone. I did not eat it. Confession. The point is that people came together and it was really, really beautiful. And I miss those times. And I work really hard to create more of those types of experiences for the people in my life on campus and today. I got away with it. And I think that you can too. And on the screen are just a few seconds from the last few months of my life. And I'm sharing this with you because there has been so much heartbreak in our world, and there has also been so much joy and hope. And in both cases, my communities were there. I use this practice, recording seconds each and every day, to be reminded of the complexity of hope and struggle. And I ask you to consider, how can you reflect on how hope and struggle with community can impact Slippery Rock? So the next few weeks and months are going to feel like a marathon for all of us. So I hope that you will create more opportunities like this for the community to come together and maybe even break bread. And students, if you do the turkey thing, save yourself the headache and the salmonella poisoning by just ordering a cooked turkey from Giant Eagle. And my last piece of advice to our students is this: there are many alumni out in the world who are thinking about you and your needs on a regular basis. Work with the folks in the Women's Center and the Pride Center and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and OIE and all across campus to share about what your needs are so that folks can advocate for you. If we don't know what you need, we cannot advocate for you. And if you're interested or need support from your alumni, please reach out. We do have a Facebook, yes, a Facebook group, and be happy to help you get away with it too. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to answering questions with the 0 time that we have.
I'm going to stop our recording, but everyone, please, virtually or out loud, please give Kris a nice, wonderful round of applause for his efforts and his wonderful speech tonight.